Today's expert is Matthew Palicki, Principal Solutions Engineer with Rego Consulting. Matthew has over 20 years of experience in technology and brings organizational insights as well as process improvement methodologies to help companies solve complex business problems. Welcome, Matthew. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sandra. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Matthew Palicki. I'm a PMP, and as Sandra said, I have been a consultant in the PPM space for about 5 years now. Prior to that, I was a practitioner where I was a project manager, but also led a PMO. So I have a lot of experience in this space of working with project management fundamentals. And I'm thrilled that you decided to take the time to join us today for this topic. Status reporting is really nothing new and is a rather fundamental concept. But if we take it for granted and begin to lose sight of some of those best practices, then our status reports might begin to lose their impact and their perceived value, and the process might become just another procedural task to tick the box and say that you've got it completed. So our goal for this session is to establish some fundamental best practices for our project status reporting. We'll cover the why, who, what, and when basics, as well as reviewing some best practices to consider and potential pitfalls to avoid so that you can deliver clear, concise, actionable status reports that empower data-driven decision-making. This is intended to be educational, inspirational, and thought-provoking. We may make references to Moventus as an example throughout our webinar, but the features and criteria that we're going to discuss here are universally applicable. Our aim is for you to be able to apply these principles regardless of your choice of PPM tooling. So let's get started. So firstly, getting into the why question. Why are we needing to do status reports in the first place? Well, really, status reports are all about communication. This might seem obvious, but it's important to be grounded in this truth before we move on and really making sure we have a good understanding with this. I've seen many occasions where status reporting just becomes looked at as more of that kind of mechanical process where we're just satisfying governance requirements, or it's sort of a big brother is watching attitude, or maybe even just that we need to use it as a way to justify that we're actually getting some work done and making progress. When we have this type of mindset or philosophy, our status reports might actually deliver very little value or be perceived to have very little value. Instead, we want to focus on how our status reports can really be a valuable communication channel that not only provides updates on progress and performance, but where this really is important is making sure that we are drawing immediate attention to any challenges we're facing that might impact our results, as well as starting a conversation on what help is needed. What are we going to need in order to resolve any challenges or blockers we might be experiencing through the course of our project? So moving on to the question of who is the status report really for? And again, this might seem very basic, but there are some nuances here that we really want to make sure that we hammer home. So the first and most obvious answer is your stakeholders, your project sponsor, the other impacted teams or business leaders who might have an interest in your project. Basically, whoever is defined in your project charter or your RACI, if you're using one, as having a role that needs to be consulted or informed. But almost as importantly, the status report greatly benefits you and especially your own project team. There's a book that I really like called The 4 Disciplines of Execution that talks about this principle. The idea that it talks about in this book is that people play differently when they're keeping score, and the emphasis there on they. Think of your status report as kind of a scorecard. But if we can stay with the sports analogy here for a minute, think of it not as the coach's scorecard, but as the player's scorecard. This is important because studies have shown that a major influencer of people's level engagement and participation in a project is when they feel like they're winning. So later we're going to talk about some strategies for how to make it immediately clear in your status report whether we are winning or losing. We'll use air quotes here. But the important thing is that this should involve your team as well, which means they should be participating in what's going into the status report, helping us craft it and making sure that they feel ownership and engagement as part of that process. All right, so moving on to some of the fun stuff here. So what should we include in our status report? Just to start with a little bit of an example here. So I found this generic example on the web, just looking up, common examples of a project status report. Some of you might find this a bit familiar, and it might be what you begin to picture when you think of a status report. If so, I apologize, because this is actually my example of what not to do. We could have a lot of fun here playing the game of how many things are wrong in this picture. I'm not going to dwell on that too much. This is really just for illustration. But a couple of things, if you were to look at some of the details on there, if you can see it, there's a bit of duplication. There's information that's up at the top of the header that's repeated again a little bit further down. There's a lot of text that appears on here, which I'll talk about more in a couple of minutes. But the big thing that just gives me so much heartache when I see this is looking at the bottom of the screen and seeing that this says page 1 of 3. I'm just going to go ahead and say this right now. If you have a 3-page status report, there's probably room for improvement there, and your stakeholders are probably very unlikely to read through all 3 pages of it. So we can certainly do better. I've seen far too many cases of status reports that become cluttered, confusing, and really deliver little value to anyone. So how can we avoid that? Well, let's talk about the components that make up a good status report. So firstly, we want to be making sure that we are including information and not just data. Sometimes, especially when we have a robust enterprise PPM tool, we have so much good data and information at our fingertips, it's tempting to want to include everything. But let's think about if we're including information or if we're merely including data in there. And what I mean by that differentiator is that data are simply facts and statistics that are gathered together for reference. Information, however, necessitates data being gathered and presented in a logical and meaningful way in order to convey a message, in order to inform. Data is just data, but information tells a story. So we want our status reports to be telling a story. Now, having said that, we do need some essential data identifiers in order for a report to be meaningful. Some of the basics, though, what's the name of the project? Who is the project manager? What date was this report created? Maybe when was the last status report done? But again, only enough identifiers that are really going to help us to begin telling that story. Then having some sort of brief narrative status summary. 1 to 2 sentences is really the idea here. We don't want to carry on for an entire paragraph. People are going to probably tune out and not read the whole thing. I'm not a fan of status reports that are mostly text. I'll come back to that more in a minute. But typically the first thing that the reader might look for is kind of the headline. Give me that brief, direct summary sentence that says something meaningful about the current progress and performance. Now, what we don't want that summary to be is something like, things are going well, no changes since the last status report. Now that might be accurate to state that, but if that is accurate, we might want to word that a little bit differently, because that kind of sounds like, all right, what good is this if I'm just reading something that says, oh, things are going well, no changes, then why are we even reading this? But maybe we might say something like, scope, schedule, and budget remain on target, we're on track to meet the next major milestone, no significant known risks or issues. Then that is saying the same thing, but in a more meaningful way. It's also helpful to present in some format maybe what we have accomplished since the last report, and headlines of what we plan to accomplish next. Update on those commitments or tasks that have been done. And this could be a narrative, although I generally, again, advise against that. Some sort of visual I think is better. Maybe it's a short bullet list or a table of tasks or milestones or to-dos if we're using those to track our progress. Maybe some sort of a visual or a widget. But we want to take great care not to include every minute detail of activity, nor to exclude anything that's really relevant to telling the story, but really just including everything and only everything that your audience is going to care about for this particular report. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we're including some key metrics. Most commonly for traditional waterfall projects are going to have the good old iron triangle of scope, schedule, budget, often presented in kind of that red, yellow, green status, or red, amber, green if you've heard of them referred to as RAG metrics. But maybe it's informative to include a metric on your staffing. Does our current EAC and resource utilization reflect any changes to the original estimated resource effort? Staffing issues is one of the most common reasons for project delays, so your stakeholders will most likely want to see something about this. Metrics might also include data about risks, issues, or change requests. Although we do want to use caution here because this could become a slippery slope toward an overloaded status report that loses its impact, we want to be selective. We might have a very long list of risks, and we don't necessarily want all of them included in our status report. Maybe a couple of key risks or ones that we think could need to warrant some attention for this reporting period. Similarly with issues, maybe if there's just one or two key issues that we want to draw attention to, let's include those, but we maybe don't want to include every little minute detail that might not really warrant the attention of our audience here. And once again, visuals are preferred wherever possible. Having those nice red, amber, green indicators, perhaps burn dials or graphs. Basically, if you can convey your message with a picture instead of words, you can. So my asterisk for a summary there is, again, this could be narratives or visuals, but thinking with that, especially that last point on metrics, less is more. What is the least amount of information needed to clearly communicate if we are winning or losing? That is, if our project is on track or if there's areas where we're having challenges that need to draw attention. If you've heard the phrasing that's used often, TLDR, which is short for too long didn't read. Sadly, I have to confess, sometimes my own children use that on me because I can be a bit wordy. So the TLDR is the short summary. Give me the headlines, give me the short summary. And when we're thinking about it from that approach, we might have to find a way to come up with multiple different views or presentations of our status report so that the content is aligned and contextually appropriate for the various stakeholders. You might have one bit of information that's very important to your PMO team that's going to be getting the status report, but perhaps you're also giving a status report to the finance team, and they only care about the finance metrics. They're not interested in seeing everything about your risks and issues. So we might want to keep that in mind as well. If we have multiple audiences, maybe we need a different view or different presentation in order to make sure that it is really being effective for the particular audience. All right, so getting to the question of when is the right time or cadence to be reporting on status? This is going to be the easiest one, short and sweet, with just a very simple slide here. Drum roll, please. There's really only one correct answer to when we should deliver our status reports, and that is consistently. So your own organization or PMO likely has established some business rules for the timing of when status reports should be done, and of course you should adhere to those rules. But in my experience, the appropriate timing can vary based on several different factors. So most commonly, we will see status reports that are done weekly, no big surprise here. But let's think about that for a minute. If we have some major programs or long-running projects, do we really want that to be a weekly status report? Because very little might change from week to week, and so a weekly report might seem intrusive and not really deliver a whole lot of valuable information. In those cases, maybe every fortnight or once a month would be more appropriate. And think about the math on this. Let's say we have a project that's a year in duration, 50 weeks, make it easy. If we were to produce a status report every single week, we're reporting on progress in increments of every 2%. Do your stakeholders really care about every 2% change in progress? Maybe they do. I can't really answer that for you. But the point here is that I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach as to when. Thinking of a couple of other considerations, let's say you're in a hybrid environment. Maybe you have some agile practices as part of your project delivery, and you're delivering work in 2-week sprints, and you're still expected to deliver regular status reports. So in that case, maybe we want to do a status report at the end of every sprint. And further, it might morph a little bit to align with those agile practices, and it might become closer to what we might call a sprint retrospective. But that's a topic for another day, another webinar. Conversely, we might have some very small projects that are running and following a very lightweight governance model. We had a large number of these when I was running my PMO. They were still considered projects, but they were often managed by like a functional lead or subject matter expert rather than a dedicated project manager, and they didn't require the usual level of rigor and governance. In cases like this, you might do status reports less frequently. You might not even require them at all for this types of projects, but merely ask them to consistently update their progress on milestone tasks or percent complete. So this is going to really be determined by your organizational standards and business rules. All right, now that we've gotten through some of those questions, the who, what, where, why, when, well, not where, let's talk a little bit about some best practices to consider and some pitfalls potentially to avoid. So by now, hopefully you understand where I stand on this example on the left and why I'm not a big fan of that here. But I want to be really clear here. We don't want to go too far to the other extreme, as I've seen people do sometimes. So, tongue-in-cheek a little bit here, we don't want this guy on the right to be our replacement there either, my friendly little dumpster fire there saying, oh, everything's fine. So how can we find that sweet spot that's giving us a happy middle ground? Well, let's talk about some suggestions for this. All right, getting into several potential pitfalls and related best practices here. The first one I've already mentioned a few times, but I really want this to stick with you. That is finding the right balance between visuals and text. I think it's just keeping it simple here. I think the classic 80-20 rule is a good guideline. If we try to have it mostly 80% visuals, 20% text, I think that's going to be a really good kind of guardrail to stick to. One of my CIOs, where we used to do a lot of our status reporting for, he would get those status reports and he admitted to me, he said, look, when I get this, I look at one thing. I'm going to read the headline and I'm going to look at the status indicator for the budget and see, are you red or green? That's all I really care about. How are you handling my money? So keep that in mind when we're thinking about the visuals there. The second one that I have listed is also probably the second most common issue that I see with status reporting, and that's people who are afraid to draw any negative attention or afraid of consequences that might come up if we say that things are wrong or off track or that anything is anything other than green. So we often refer to this as feel-good green. My apologies if you thought we were making a Motley Crue reference there. This is just a colloquial term that we use. We don't want to see any feel-good green on our status reports. This doesn't benefit or help anyone. It doesn't make any problems go away. It just kind of hides them. And if we go back to the goal at the beginning of this conversation here, we want to make sure we're helping our colleagues understand this is a communication tool and that one of the main purposes of our status reporting is to get help when we need it. Then, if that's the case, we should not fear revealing when something is out of parameters and needs some extra attention. Nextly, thinking about the types of metrics that we're going to include. Lead or lag metrics both have their own type of value, but they are distinctly different. Lag metrics, that is stating something that's happened previously in the past, are often, not always, but often merely just informative because it's something that's already happened and typically we can't really change or influence that. For example, how much of our budget have we already spent? It's information and it's not just data, but we can't really act upon that. So conversely, lead metrics are forward-looking and therefore can still be influenced. For example, we might state instead how much of our budget is remaining and how much are we forecasting to spend. Thinking carefully about which measures to include and how we're going to display them is really going to help make sure that we are telling a story and not just sharing data that's not really actionable. Some stakeholders might like to see how much has been spent, that lag measure, but it really is more actionable to communicate the forecast, our lead measure, because that can still be influenced. Now, we could easily say, well, somebody might want to see both, and we can easily give into that temptation to display both. Maybe that's appropriate. Again, considering our audience, we have to think about what they want to see. But I would caution instead, let's see if there's a way to tell that full story easier without cluttering it up with lots of metrics. Maybe if you're using a burn dial widget or a progress ring, So just really using intention when we're thinking about the metrics that we include. The next one, we've already talked quite a bit about knowing your audience, but this is really important. Maybe we need a particular layout for the steering committee and executive sponsors, but a different one for the IT and PMO stakeholders, maybe a third one for our finance business partners. Think about how can we simply and flexibly meet the varied needs of all of our different stakeholders without creating a lot of rework or non-value-added data that clutters up a single status report. And then the next one here is also a potential pitfall, trouble spot, vanity metrics. We want to be careful to avoid those. Now, what do we mean by vanity metrics? These are metrics that are accurate, and they might look or sound good, but again, they really don't tell a story, or maybe they don't tell the whole story. For example, we could display on there the total number of tasks that we've completed, or the total number of tasks we completed since our last status report. That's accurate, but it doesn't tell a whole story. For instance, those tasks that we completed, how many of them were completed on time? How many of them were late? How many tasks are remaining? That the number of tasks by itself doesn't really tell us a lot. It's missing some things. So it might look good to say we completed 12 tasks since our last status report. But on its own, that doesn't really tell a whole lot of a story. So that's why we refer to those as kind of vanity metrics. Now, finally here, the last one, let's talk about some best practices around layout and design. And these fall under a lot of general kind of like user experience and user interface kind of design. So these are just some good all-around best practices when we're thinking about this. In general, just because of the way the human brain works and the eyes like to flow information, we generally like to see words on the left, visuals on the right. Generally a good idea to put the lead measures above lag measures if we're including both, because we want to think about where are we drawing the eye towards. What is the eye going to capture and land on first? It's always helpful to group relevant data together with clear titles and breaks explaining what they are. I've seen places where things are kind of like scattered all over the place. You'll have risks up at the top and issues down at the bottom, and then a bar chart on risks and issues in a totally different place. And you find your eyes kind of jumping all around back and forth to try and put the context together. And we want to try to design for that eye pattern movement that is most natural, and that is kind of the scrolling eye pattern. If you think about how we use our phone and kind of the scrolling from top to bottom, that's generally the way that the eye flows with information as well. So just think about the layout of this information and how it's all going to come together for us. So as we bring it all together here, I wanted to put together a visual example and not just talk about this a little bit. This is an example that I put together using our own enterprise tooling here. And there may be varied opinions and preferences on how you pull this together, but this is an example of how I might construct kind of a compelling and actionable status report for my stakeholders. And if you can think about some of those layout principles that I just shared with you, we try to have the words on the left, visuals on the right. We try to use a little bit of color here without overwhelming it. There's still room for improvement. For example, you might have noticed where your eye was drawn to first, and if you're anything like me, it was probably that pie chart down there. Now that pie chart is informational, it's helpful, but it's pretty big and it draws your eyes, and it's not the most important thing on the status report necessarily, so I might want to adjust that and tweak that a little bit. So I kept that on there just to give a little bit of example and how we would think about this. So getting us back to that goal that we stated at the beginning, I genuinely hope this has helped give you some insights and inspiration on what a well-crafted status report might look like and how it can benefit you, your stakeholders, as well as your projects. It does not require a PPM tool just to create status reports, but certainly having a well-designed and user-friendly tool like Moventus will make your life easier by helping you avoid rework and that dreaded copy-paste cycle of having to populate information in multiple different tools and sources. I think that if your organization is looking for a tool set to help you bring more consistency and simplicity to your PPM practices, if you're looking to reduce the friction that's created from multiple sources of truth and siloed ways of working, I encourage you to reach out to us here at Rego Consulting. We'd be happy to give you a tour of our Moventus platform, or even just to continue a conversation with you around PPM best practices. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for sharing your time with me today, and I'm going to turn it back over to you, Sandra.
Great presentation, Matthew. Thank you very much. And to those viewing this webinar, thank you for your time. We hope this information was helpful to you.